What's up? Welcome in Hoge and Jahns with you for sort of a mini episode here. It's been a busy week, and obviously with the Bears doing something they've never done before and fire a head coach mid-season. And we wanted to make sure we got you a little episode here going into your Monday morning commute before we hopefully hear from some members of the front office at some point Monday. As we're recording this on Sunday night, those details have not been finalized yet. But Johnsy, you had a bunch of reporting with Dianna Russini and a great story in The Athletic, which if you're not subscribed, you should be for reasons like this. Theathletic.com/Hoge Jahns is where you go to subscribe. And we wanted to make sure that we got together here before the weekend was over to kind of discuss some of the details that you and Dianna were able to put together in what has been a really remarkable six game stretch. It really hasn't been that long since we were in London and everything was going great.
Everything was good.
I can't believe how fast this whole thing turned around.
That Washington game, as we kind of detailed in our story, it's just it's amazing how much it stuck with the team.
Yeah,
they never were able to get over it. It's beyond how it played out at the end with Tyreek Stevenson doing whatever he was doing with the fans in the end zone, not paying attention to the play, which we have discussed a few times. It's just how Matt Eberflus then handled everything after the fact and how much that stuck with players and how much that bothered players. That was the start of the end for Matt Eberflus.
Yeah, so that let's back up a little bit and start with what you were able to gather from the locker room on Thursday in Detroit, because that's kind of how this story starts. And I think from my reading of your story and how this is kind of built since what happened in that Washington game, it just seems like it was a boiling point, and things just kind of reached a point where they could no longer really stay silent and let Flus just go through this one more time. Give us your sense of, I mean, you were obviously there on Thursday too, but then you were able to hear a little bit more about what happened when you weren't in the room.
Well, let me start Thursday after the game. Obviously, 32 seconds. Matt Eberflus doesn't call a timeout. We know how that played out, but it took a long time for the media to gain entry to the locker room. Usually they say it's 10 to 15 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes, a cooling off period. It took a long period of time for us to get in there. So now you're in there, and the first thing I noticed almost instantly was the presence of Kevin Warren. He usually just walks through, maybe says hi to a couple of us. Like there's been numerous times where he's leaving the locker room as we're coming in. But this time he stayed in the locker room, talking to players, different team leaders, talking to Ted Cruz, his special advisor. So like your instincts are going off. So Dianna and I later learned that there was, call it a powerful, ugly moment where a lot of the players, started by Jalen Johnson, had just had enough. So you have the team prayer with Eberflus, and then he starts going into his speech and whatnot. A speech that the players have heard before, and they had enough. Like this was it. We're not hearing this anymore, and they started yelling back at their head coach. When that happens, I don't think there's any coming back from it. It was so emotional, so passionate that Eberflus left the locker room. Probably went somewhere else in the locker room. These locker rooms have different rooms, but left the part where all the players are in it. There's no coming back from that. So to see Kevin Warren in there, to see Ryan Poles in there, like you knew something happened. So to learn that later, that there was just this scene with Jalen Johnson yelling at Eberflus, with other players backing Jalen Johnson, also going at it with Eberflus, basically questioning, why didn't you call a timeout? Like, what's going on here? I think you had a moment that was just a lot of pent-up frustrations being released after another ugly loss where coaching decision played a huge role in the outcome of the game.
Well, and that lends some credence to why it just kind of felt different going to bed Thursday night and waking up Friday morning feeling like, yeah, this might actually be the time where this happens. And it had to happen. It's a little remarkable to me that getting that context from your story with Dianna, that they still needed this big meeting the next morning, that they still couldn't at least delay Matt Eberflus's press conference. But they chose to handle that how they handled it.
We put that in our story too. Yeah. So they were George McCaskey, Ryan Poles, and Kevin Warren were essentially meeting at the same time as the press conference. They've been meeting for a little bit there. So by 11 o'clock, according to what we learned, that's when the decision was made. At least Eberflus informed his assistants, and that was it. By 12:30 is my understanding, Matt Eberflus had left the building. So it's just to hear that like scene described to me, there was no way that George McCaskey could allow his tenure to continue, Matt Eberflus's tenure to continue. He already lost the locker room. He was losing it starting in Washington in the days that followed that. So, to have that scene unfold, there's no coming back from it.
No, there wasn't. And at least they had the the brains to finally pull the trigger at that point, because it would have just gotten ugly and uglier from that point. These last 5 games would have been just completely useless, and perhaps had even more horrible effects for the future that can affect things down the road.
Affect your quarterback maybe.
Right, and there's too much at stake here with Caleb Williams the rest of the way. So, okay, so with that context, we can now go back to Washington, where the headline of this story is the Bears finally fired Matt Eberflus, but he lost the locker room long ago. And there were already some cracks in the foundation. We can get into the Shane Waldron stuff a little bit later.
It's a big part of it.
It is a big part of it. And so you can sort of sense this coming, despite, if you're really paying attention during the first 6 games when the Bears were actually 4-2. I keep going back to the podcast we did after the Colts game and how sort of on red alert you and I were about what was going on offense. So you kind of have these cracks, and then for what to have happen in Washington happen, what stood out to me, Johns, was that I've been on the record for weeks now saying this, that the moment Matt Eberflus lost me was the play before the Hail Mary, with the defense he called and how he handled it afterward. Basically defiant that it didn't matter when it obviously mattered. And it's just such a blatant lie to pretend that it didn't. Reading your story, it was obvious to me that that's when he started to lose a lot of his own players with how that specific thing was handled.
Well, because they believed that play mattered. Those 13 yards were extremely important. If those 13 yards aren't gained, Jaden Daniels' throw is 10 yards short of the end zone, 15 yards short of the end zone. They may be running one of those crazy screen plays where the ball gets thrown around a bit, and then the ball carrier gets eventually tackled. So by gaining those 13 yards, everything changed. They didn't call a timeout after that to set everybody up. So, and then it's how he defended it, how Matt Eberflus defended it after the game, and then how he continued to defend it publicly and then behind the scenes. That's what got players upset. And then they saw how Tyreek Stevenson was treated, dragged through the mud a little bit, right? There was the Jay Glazer report about him leaving practice, which, it turned out to be not as bad as it was, right? Briefly left practice, came back. Players had problems with that. You had a player who's supposed to be a starter. We're not defending what Tyreek Stevenson did. I guess we're criticizing the handling of it by Matt Eberflus.
Well, that's what I want to say. To me, and correct me if I'm wrong, reading your story, and it's kind of what my understanding was the whole thing too, was it it wasn't necessarily that Tyreek Stevenson was being punished. He probably deserved to be punished. It was that meanwhile, the head coach wasn't taking any accountability for
That's
his
it.
own
That's
mistakes
100% it.
on it. So, and that's what it comes back to. You, if you're going to hold your players accountable, you have to hold yourself accountable. And he wasn't doing it. And that's exactly how you lose a locker room.
And then, like, later, you and I both picked up on this. Matt Eberflus started going out of his way to take responsibility for, like, almost everything. It starts with me, starts with the head coach. I'm the head coach. Starts and ends at my door. Like, all that stuff. It was just empty to some of the players because of what happened in Washington and some other things that happened behind the scenes, specifically with Shane Waldron. How players had concerns going back to, like, training camp about what was happening on offense. Then you saw things, and you saw the red flags earlier in the year. Things got better. I think everybody hoped that things had changed with Shane Waldron. Then you had the Washington game. Then you had the 19-3 loss against the Patriots a couple weeks later, where all those red flags were beyond valid, where players had enough, like, to the point where the coaches even acknowledged this wasn't working.
Yeah.
Something had to change. Like, Matt Eberflus had to make a change.
And so I'm also sensing some astonishment, like the rest of us, that Waldron was even hired in the first place. When you had 13 candidates, another one of these candidates is now remarkably your interim head coach. And so let's get into the Waldron aspect of it, because you reported on some things that I've mentioned here and there a little bit of, through the season. One of the nuggets that I thought was interesting was, like, Waldron just clearly didn't hit it off with the players, whether that's the way in which he led, the way in which he communicated, but also in some of the actual schematic things he did. And I've mentioned this, I've been talking about this a lot this season, just looking at the tape. Like, they have been running different stuff in the run game. And you had a little bit of a nugget on that too.
Yeah, I think there was 2 years of something working with Chris Morgan. And I get it. The Justin Fields running definitely skewers the numbers a bit. I understand that. But they were still productive with Khalil Herbert as their lead back. It still worked. He still had a lot of good yardage. So to see Waldron, how should I describe it? Almost ignore that and insist on doing it this way when your run game coordinator is used to doing it a different way.
Well, and that's, sorry to interrupt you, but that was one of the things that just I couldn't even quite understand reading the story was when I noticed they were doing stuff different in the run game. My initial assumption was it was Chris Morgan, because he's the run game coordinator. Like, you gave him an additional title. So maybe it was like, oh, he didn't necessarily agree with what Luke Getsy was doing in the past, so he made these changes. No, it turns out that despite giving the run game coordinator that new title, the OC was actually changing the run game coordinator's desired preference on how to run the ball. That goes back up to the head coach.
Yep. Players had their concerns, voiced their concerns, and it was met with, let's call it indifference in a sense. I mean, we started hearing it from the players almost immediately about how they wanted to be coached, how some things weren't working, how they had different suggestions about doing different things, different personnel, different formations, doing this, that, and the other. And sometimes you just want to be listened to. And they weren't. Another reason for frustration. And then, like, especially during the game, like, everything that kept coming up about, hey, can we try scripting things better so we could be more in tune with what you're trying to do? Yeah, okay, we could try this. We have a different way of doing things, but I get it, and I thought that was an overblown storyline at the time. But again, another red flag to add to the many red flags that were adding up for the offensive side of the football.
So then Thomas Brown takes over, and you had a bunch of interesting nuggets in there too, just about how quickly things changed, including some, on the record comments from Chris Beatty, the wide receivers coach. But the communication, scheme changes, and specifically what he was doing with Caleb as well.
Yeah, it just seemed to be a different. I keep going back to vibe and energy to use to describe it. Maybe I should find some better words, but something dramatically changed when Thomas Brown walked in the offensive team meeting room, and he was the one in front of everyone. He was no longer taking a back seat in offensive meetings behind Shane Waldron. He was the one steering the ship now. His messaging was better. His direct approach was better. The communication, according to all those assistants, was better. They knew what to expect. He knew what he wanted to do, how he was going to get there. And it involved Caleb Williams. Most like if you're into like X's and O's, to hear them kind of like so the pure progression system, that's a lot to put on a rookie quarterback. Scanning the whole field pre-snap, during the snap, like that's a lot to ask a rookie to do. Some even the best veterans, 5, 6, 7 years before they master something like that, when they have that much game film in their heads and at their disposal to go through. That was a lot to ask out of a rookie. Like, I like the idea of challenging him, especially if he can handle it, but sometimes you need to give him some simpler things as well. Even, I don't think simpler is the best way to put it, but they were more direct in how they wanted him to play. 1 read, 2 read, let's run a little bit. Go be the playmaker you could be. They tried to simplify at least his approach. Like 1, 2, go do what you do.
It's also interesting to me that like you have a number of offensive assistants on the staff that knew Waldron, came over here with Waldron, been coaching with Waldron, and yet I think what stands out to me is that how quickly even it sounds like everybody got on board with Thomas Brown right away.
Yeah.
And sometimes like guys can be weird, not weird. Weird's not the right word. They're loyal. They're loyal to their guys. You have friends in this business, and it wouldn't have been completely surprising for even some of the other assistants on this team to kind of just be like, whatever, our guy Shane's out of here. We're not going to listen to this guy. But instead, it sounds like it's been the opposite. They quickly bought into what Thomas Brown was doing right away, just like the players did. And I think that also shows why Thomas Brown's been named the interim head coach here.
Yeah. I think that's a move done with the player support. I think Ryan Poles had heard, seen, experienced Thomas Brown taking control of that offensive side of the football, having command of the room, being a leader of men. You're going to hear that term come up a lot in our next podcast over the next 6-7 weeks. To see him own the moment and then have some success on game days against 3 good defenses in the Packers, Vikings, and Lions. To have your rookie quarterback have success in key moments against those teams, I think it's meaningful. Now, can the next 5 weeks, is this the start of something? We'll see. But the Thomas Brown move, to my understanding, is one made with a lot of player support going forward.
Yes, and I will add this, that I have been flooded with text messages, as I'm sure you have too, Johns, in the last 48 hours or so, 72 hours. Most of those have been about one of 2 things, or sometimes both. A lot of those texts have been astonishment that the Bears let Matt Eberflus speak to the media at 9 a.m. on Friday and then fired him right after. I'm not even sure I put that much stock into it in the moment, but from the amount of people I've heard like appalled by that, and I'm talking about like significant voices around the league and the football business.
Yes.
That is actually, I think, going to be something that they might need to overcome a little bit in this head coaching hire. Now, I'm not saying money, Caleb Williams can't override it, but that might be something they have to address with candidates who might be asking about that themselves in some of these conversations, some of these interviews, or maybe the agents are, whatever. That is actually a bigger deal. It's a pretty big deal, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The other thing,
sometimes the text is as simple as, WTF, like question mark, what was that? And to your point, this isn't just something local. A lot of people around the league took notice of this.
Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. It's a little bit of a problem. I don't know that's going to be the end of the world, but unfortunately, the Bears have a little bit of a reputation here they got to overcome. It's not just this, obviously. It's years and years and years. And I think there's just a lot of people around the league that are like thinking things are going to be different now that Kevin Warren's in charge. And the way the firing went down left some doubt in that area. That's not even coming from us. It's coming from people that I have heard from a lot over the weekend. Now, on the good side, the other thing I've been getting a lot of texts about is Thomas Brown. And it has been almost universal praise. I mean, there are so many people around the league that have worked with him. Even going back to some of his college stops, I've heard from some people. They are intrigued to see Thomas Brown get this opportunity and feel like he has a real shot to be a head coach here quickly, whether that's here in Chicago after this interim stint or elsewhere around the league. In fact, I would say it almost feels like a foregone conclusion that this guy gets a head coaching opportunity beyond these next 5 weeks. And it's just a matter of if that's in Chicago or elsewhere.
I hope it's a real shot. Like, I hope this is taken seriously. Like, I hope the next 5 weeks are taken extremely seriously by Ryan Poles and Kevin Warren. Probably specifically Kevin Warren. Watch this closely. If you see Thomas Brown building a rapport with your defensive players, like this is him now extending his influence, his command beyond Caleb Williams, beyond the offensive players. If he starts having a positive effect on the defensive players, you better take stock in that. You may like Ben Johnson, but you don't know if Ben Johnson can actually do that. And I'm serious about this. Just go back to what Colton Pouncey was saying last week on one of our podcasts. Like, you need to learn if he can do that. So if you're seeing that from Thomas Brown, I don't care how much you like Ben Johnson. You have to value what you're actually experiencing, like firsthand, more so than this list that you're creating and the excitement you may have to meet with all these candidates. Like, you can't have like some, I don't know, like what's the best way to put it? It just wouldn't make sense to me to take a risk, especially if that favorability, that support extends past the QB room. Like, Caleb Williams is one thing. Like, if he makes a connection with Thomas Brown, that's good. Receivers, that's good. Offensive line, that's good. Assistant coaches, that's good. But if he starts connecting with these defensive players, all these veterans, that is such a bonus going forward. You cannot ignore it. So I hope they take this seriously. I hope they're looking at everything that Thomas Brown does on both sides of the ball.
All right. Well, we got a lot of time to talk about Thomas Brown, talk about where this might be headed, other head coaching candidates. This thing is going to last for a while because of the Bears doing this in season. But we wanted to get on here and at least get into some of the nitty-gritty of this reporting that Jahns and Dianna Russini did so well in The Athletic. Again, theathletic.com/Hoge Jahns is where you can go to read the story and subscribe if you are not already subscribed. And also, as always, you can check out all of our merch. HoganJahns.com had a great Black Friday sale going on over the weekend. And you can follow us on the socials pretty much everywhere as well. We will be back probably not till Wednesday morning. We'll see how the news flows and stuff. We do expect some press conferences here and some things that we'll get into, but probably get close back onto our regular schedule. But this was big news, extenuating circumstances, of course. So wanted to make sure we got you this little mini episode over the weekend, at least to end the weekend. And if you happen to miss it, check out our show from Friday too, where we broke everything down closer in real time as the firing went down. All right. We will talk to you later in the week.
We'll see you.